Hey everyone, It's here. In this video, I'll conclude talking about the Diary of a Wimpy Kid series. If you have not seen the first three parts of this series, I recommend you watch those videos first and then come back. If you've already seen them or just came back, let's get into this. Today we'll be talking about the final 5 books in the series. These are books 13 through 17, and as always, in between some books, we will take breaks to talk about other Wimpy Kid related media. Now let's head on to the first book of this final video, Diary of a Wimpy Kid, The Meltdown. There are not any new recurring characters introduced in this book, but there are quite a few things I have to say about other characters, which I'll be talking about during the Things I Noticed segment. One thing that I will mention right now, though, is that this is the final proper appearance of the pig, which, as I just said, I'll talk about later on. So let's move on ahead to the story. This book reveals something new about the neighborhood Greg lives in, Surrey Street. It's that the neighborhood is divided into two sides, the upper side which Greg and Riley live on, and the lower side. These two sides of the neighborhood despise each other, and they'll do anything to make sure people from the other side don't play on their side. And there's one part of this story where, due to large amounts of snowing, it becomes really challenging for Greg and Riley to go to school, especially since the safety patrol, which at this point is all girls, won't let the boys walk on the road. And now, one weekend, Greg is forced to go outside in the snow by Susan, so Greg and Riley decide to build an igloo, but they get ambushed by neighboring kids during the process. This leads to a giant war in Greg's side of the neighborhood, with everyone making igloos and fighting each other. But this leads to the lower Surrey Street kids being able to sled down the hill while they're distracted, which immediately upsets all the upper kids. So they build a massive wall with a huge defense, but due to the lower street's strategic thinking, the wall ends up falling down. This leads to a massive free-for-all, where not only do the Surrey Street kids start fighting each other, the safety patrol joins in the fight, the Worley Street kids join in the fight, and even the Mingos join in the fighting. And this all eventually ends when the snowplow finally reaches their neighborhood, and now everyone is too exhausted to fight anymore. And that's how the book gets off. Now for my opinions, this book is a bit better than The Getaway, but I still don't think it's as great as many people make it out to be. A lot of the issues I had with The Getaway are still here, and there's also a new issue the series has that is very noticeable starting here. And that's how books start introducing a bunch of new characters and never use them again. It's a shame since some of these characters could potentially be interesting as recurring characters, especially the ones who live near Greg. But that just doesn't happen. This is disappointing as, without any consistent supporting cast, it feels like the world of Diary of a Wimpy Kid is very self-contained, and the books continue to lose even more of their realism. But one positive thing I have to say about this book is how there are quite a few characters from previous books who make reappearances here. I'll talk about that in more detail later on, but for now I'll say that it's nice seeing Jeff Kinney just remembering the vast amount of characters he's made by bringing back a few of them. That's all for my opinions. So let's move on to some of the things I noticed. First of all, I want to talk about the minor story which this book starts off on, that being the country project. Greg talks about how he had this project in school where he had to pick a country to talk about. And now Greg picked Italy, but unfortunately a lot of other kids picked that, so he didn't get it. And instead what happened is that Greg was forced to do a presentation on Malta. And Greg didn't really know a lot about Malta, so it was kind of an issue when the day the project was due and that everyone was going to present them, he realized that he barely even started it. So Greg, in his infinite wisdom, decides that he's just gonna wing it and put random information on the poster board he has. And he just completely makes things up. And Greg gets kind of worried because he realizes that a kid in his grade has parents that are actually from Malta, so he was worried that he was gonna get reported by them. What ends up happening is that a couple of kids didn't have enough space for their projects, so they're fighting over who would get to keep the space. And this ended up blowing up and turning into a huge fight. And Greg thought he was in the clear, but he ended up having to do the project again. One character who didn't appear for a really long time actually reappears in this book, and that's none other than Fregley. And now, it's not really that big of an appearance, it's just a similar thing to what they did in the first book, where Greg's going up to Riley's house and he has to try to avoid Fregley. But it is nice seeing that Jeff Kinney is starting to bring back some previous characters because when there's just a consistent supporting cast, it makes the world of the books feel way more alive. But while Fregley does get brought back in this book, there's one character that makes its final appearance here, and that's none other than the pig. The story is that during the events of the getaway, the Heffleys left the pig at a kennel, which explains why it was completely gone in the getaway. And when they came back, the pig was really upset and it started acting out. So Frank sent the pig to obedience school and it ended up breaking out. And they just haven't heard from it again. So yeah, that is the final appearance of the pig. But surprisingly enough, right after this, we're reintroduced to other characters who haven't appeared for quite a while. And the keyword being characters, plural. In this book, they reintroduce the Mingos, and there's this whole storyline where Greg's school gets sent home early, and so Greg decides to not go through the snow, by going on the bus with the Worley Street kids. But then one kid does something that gets the whole bus in trouble, and when they realize that they're not from Worley Street, all the other kids pin it on Greg and Rowley. But get this, right? Some of the Worley Street kids believe that lie, so they started chasing Greg and Rowley. But then the two of them go into the forest to hide, but Greg ends up finding a bunch of abandoned cars in one place. He finds none other than the belt buckle of Meckley Mingo, which, if you remember reading Diary of Wimpy had Hard Luck, Meckley Mingo was the leader of the Mingos. And Greg mentioned how he always had his belt. And Greg luckily is able to leave right before the Mingos wake up. And you can actually see that in this moment, the Mingos are being woken up because you can see in the background that they're getting out of the cars that they're in. And this comes back at the very end of the book during the fight where you see the Mingos coming out of the woods, and you see Meckley Mingo holding this thing which Greg accidentally dropped when they were leaving the Mingos hideout. And Greg is super worried because that means the Mingos are after them, but luckily, they stop fighting once the whole thing with the snowplow happens. I just want to say this, the dab is in this book. Here's the picture. I don't want to speak of this again. We're moving on. And now, I've already technically mentioned these, but I want to go into a bit more detail. This is both the reintroduction of the Safety Patrol and the Worley Street kids. With the Safety Patrol, we find out that every guy gradually got taken off the Safety Patrol for messing around. And now only girls on the Safety Patrol, and we see that the guys have to go on the sidewalk while only the girls are allowed on the road. And we also learn how a lot of the Safety Patrol gets really upset because kids aren't allowed to throw any snowballs until they're home. But a lot of kids will go home and then go back just so that they can throw snowballs at the safety patrols who can't do anything. Which is why they're so upset when they go to Surrey Street at the end of the book. And now the Worley Street kids, I already mentioned that whole part at the bus, but there is another part where Greg talks about how they went to this big hill that was at Rowley's Country Club, which once again, another neat reference, where Greg talks about how it's great for sledding, but how eventually the Surrey Street kids got kicked off by the Worley Street kids. And from the looks of it, at the end of the book, the Worley Street kids got kicked off of that area, and that's why they went to Surrey Street to go sled there, which led to them also joining in the fight. I just want to say that if you don't know why so many people hate Manny, and I haven't given you enough reasons, here's this picture of Manny Snowman. Does this look like a human being that you should trust? In fact, does this look like a human being to you? Manny is something else. This is not normal human behavior. Lastly, I want to talk about the final battle because it's honestly a pretty cool scene. What happens is that they're defending the wall, but then this one kid who was on the hillside but moved to the lower side tells them that the lower side is planning a secret attack. So half of them go down secretly to stop their attack plan, but they end up being tricked by that guy, which leads to their base being destroyed. But right after they're done being ambushed, that's when the safety patrols appear, they start fighting kids, and it leads to honestly one of the coolest scenes in the whole series, where it's this entire two-spread page that's the largest picture in the entire series, where the entire thing is people fighting each other. And it just goes to show that Jeff Kinney is clearly putting in a lot of effort with the artwork compared to some of the stuff we saw in The Getaway. I may not see this book as very great, but this is a really good moment. Also, I forgot to mention this, but right before that too, the Worley Street kids also join in on the fight. And afterwards, that's when the Mingos join in, and Greg and Rowley hide in an igloo because the whole thing is complete chaos. And now I want to talk about one thing I mentioned when I was talking about Cabin Fever, about how the snowplow showing up really late was an important thing to remember, because in the end, what stops the fighting is the snowplow going in and stopping everything. And from the looks of it, the snowplow driver doesn't even care about the kids, because he just goes right past them. Like, they're lucky that was a snowplow, or else a lot of those kids would have gotten run over. But yeah, by the time all the snow is gone thanks to the snowplow, there really isn't anything to fight over by that point. That's everything I noticed while reading. Anyway, let's move on to the first information of this video, where we'll be talking about the Diary of a Wimpy Kid musical. Yes, this is a real thing. In 2016, the production company, the Children's Theater Company, created and performed a play that was based on both the first Diary of a Wimpy Kid book and Roderick Rules. This was extremely obscure, and little was known about it for a long time until 2021 when they decided to put on the musical again. In fact, just last year, they performed the musical again afterwards. Now, I want to give my opinions on it. I really enjoyed the play. It feels like it really gets the point of Diary of a Wimpy Kid. And what's also great is that it takes some aspects from the books and some things from the movies, and it also adds a couple of new things itself. So this feels like a fresh take on Diary of a Wimpy Kid without having to change the core of what the series is about. Every actor here does a good job. Also, the set design here is great. Apparently, the budget for the musical was over $1 million, and you can really tell. I watched this really recently, but this might be my new favorite modern piece of Wimpy Kid content. There's nothing else I have to say, so let's move on to the next book, Diary of a Wimpy Kid, Wrecking Ball. There's only one character who leaves the series in this book, but it's a very noticeable one, that being Fregley. So at this point, I'm certain that every supporting character from the first book, besides a couple of family members, is all gone now. That's probably not a good sign. This book follows the Heffleys getting a large sum of money after the passing of their great aunt, Reva. The Heffleys decide that they will add an addition to their house, and Susan decides that the addition will be a larger kitchen. And there's one small thing that's really important to mention, and that's the fact that the Heffley family owns a hot tub. It's a general nuisance, nearly killed Greg twice. It's not important now, but will be later on in the story. We see the ups and downs when they are building the extension. We also see that their neighbors really hate them because of multiple incidents caused by the building of the extension. So when they find out that part of the extension is going to another neighbor's property, when they don't get permission, the extension has to be torn down. And by this point, they only have the money to patch up the hole made for the extension. Susan is really upset, and she becomes even angrier when she sees Greg's grades, as apparently the whole grade failed their final exams. And this causes Susan to believe that it might be better if they just move to a different town. They end up finding this beautiful house with an indoor pool and a large kitchen, and the Heffleys decide that they want to move there, but first, they need to sell their current house. This proves to be an issue, but at the last moment, a family decides that the house is perfect and wants to buy it. And also by now, Greg has told Riley he's moving, so Riley's just an absolute mess. The Heffleys decide to throw themselves a massive going away party, and it turns out to be really fun. It also has one of the best moments in the whole series, with Riley getting a gift for Greg of all the memories they had together, where in the end, Riley is crying, and Greg is crying with him. That shows that deep inside, while he isn't the best person, Greg truly cares about his best friend. This is the only moment for me in the entire series where it actually feels emotional reading it, because you've seen what these two have gone through. Seeing that Greg cares about Riley is a moment that feels earned. So after the party, you know what happens next? It turns out that everything they own is being moved out of the house a week earlier than they expected. Not only that, but the new people moving in didn't want the hot tub, and the person taking it out was doing it that day. And a series of possibly some of the most absurd events in the entire series happen that ends in the hot tub falling through the house all the way to the basement. The people now won't buy the house, and the bittersweet ending we had is now thrown away for whatever this garbage was. Let me talk about my opinions on this book because they are strong. This was a return to form for the Diary of Wimpy series, keyword being was. While some issues with characters are still prevalent here, at this point I can start excusing them as they're just kind of the norm now. But this finally felt like a Diary of Wimpy book that was going back to the main message of the series, being growing up, and we had one of the most emotional scenes in the entire franchise. And they just ruin it with that ending. There is no argument. This is the worst ending in the Diary of Wimpy Kid series. If you didn't want the house to be sold, fine. But they did it in the most ridiculous way possible. The once grounded series of Diary of Wimpy Kid has finally done it. They jumped the shark. At this point, there's no reason to get invested in the series. Nothing's ever going to change. It's just going to be the same cycle of wacky adventures over and over again. I could honestly continue talking about how horrendous this ending is, but I kind of want to upload this video this year, so let's move on to the things I noticed. First of all, I want to talk about the yard sale that Greg has at the beginning of the book, so he can sell a bunch of stuff that he doesn't need anymore. And of course, since this is Diary of a Wimpy Kid, things start going wrong. There's one guy who starts taking a bunch of the things from the yard sale, thinking that they're trash. But that's nowhere near as small as an issue compared to what happens next, and that it starts raining. And Greg tries to get Riley to help because he had Riley as a security guard there, but Riley tells him that his shift ended and he just leaves. And so we see Greg struggling to get everything in. And that actually brings me to my next point, and that's the fact that from the looks of it, another one of Greg's diaries got destroyed. Because if you remember in Roderick Rules, Greg started ripping out the pages of the original diary, and we never see it be brought back again. So you can assume that Greg doesn't have it anymore. We see Greg looking through the boxes that were destroyed, and when he picks it up, he finds one of his diaries, which is most likely going to be very soaked. But it's impossible to tell which one it is since they all look the same. I want to talk about an issue I have in this book, and it has to do with this one storyline having to do with this thing called the grout. One night, Greg hears his parents talking about grout in the bathroom, and what grout really is junk in bathroom tiles, but Greg imagines a monster when he hears the word grout. So this causes kid Greg to be really terrified of the grout, constantly being worried about having to deal with it. And when Susan tells Greg what the grout actually is, he still doesn't believe her. But eventually, Greg stops believing in the grout until Frank has Greg cleaning the bathroom with him and he sees hair in the drain. And this causes Greg to believe that the grout is real again. And that just shows that Greg's stupidity is less of being unintelligent and more like the unawareness of a small child. Here we have this middle schooler who believes that there's a monster that is inside of everyone's plumbing. And the issue isn't really that. The main issue is that it doesn't make sense that Greg would believe this. Especially since we saw in old school, Greg didn't believe Silent Scratch was real until the moment he found the cabin. In which case, he didn't even flat out say that he believes Silent Scratch was real. He just got more worried by seeing the cabin. But here, Greg just immediately believes that the ground is real again. And that just feels wrong to me. I also want to talk about the fact that Manny has probably some sort of superpowers. I first want to go back to the long haul. Manny is able to speak perfect Spanish with only a couple hours of lessons. Because I doubt they were listening to those Spanish cities for very long. And not only that, Manny was asleep. So it feels almost supernatural how Manny was able to learn all of that so fast. And also, the meltdown kind of foreshadows this book because it shows Manny is very good with structural building, as we saw with those terrifying snowmen he made. In this book, Manny makes his own house. Like, it's not even a joking thing. Manny makes his own two-story house with a sprinkler system and everything. And yeah, while I enjoyed the majority of this book, besides the ending, this is another part which feels really jarring. I want to talk about this real quick. Greg talks about playing this game in elementary school called MASH, which stood for Mansion, Apartment, Shack, House. And it was this game where you had a bunch of options, and you would roll a dice, scratch off the options until you had one option left, and those options would be what your future life would be. And if I remember correctly, a similar thing to this was actually in the Wimpy Kid Do It Yourself book, so it's a neat callback. But there is possibly another neat callback here, and that's the fact that on one of Greg's math sheets, it actually mentions Holly. It's probably safe to assume that this is Holly Hills, who we haven't seen since the fourth book. And now, you might think that there's something that contradicts this. Greg says that this happened in the fifth grade, but Holly moved to Greg's school later. The thing is, that's a movie only thing. In the books, Holly has been going to the same school as Greg since kindergarten, as Susan even mentions that in the third wheel. That's everything I noticed while reading, so let's move on to the next book, Diary of Wimpy Kid, The Deep End. If Wrecking Ball jumped the shark, the deep end has gone so high above the shark that the book is currently exiting the Earth's atmosphere. This book has the final appearances of Uncle Gary, who's only mentioned, Greg's great-grandmother Gammy, and Grandma. The story of this book is that the Heffleys are now living with Grandma after the mess of events that happened at the end of Wrecking Ball. It seems like the Heffleys are going to be stuck there the whole summer until they get a call from Gammy. She asks them to move Uncle Gary's camper van from her driveway, and this gives the Heffleys the idea that, now that they have the camper, they should go on a road trip vacation. They go on their trip, and surprise, surprise, things start going wrong. The Heffleys accidentally go swimming in a fish hatchery. They also accidentally try to spend the night on someone's farm. When they go to a water park, Greg ends up being tossed into the river. When his bathing suit falls off, he lets go of a branch he was holding onto when someone tried to help him. And Greg doesn't get found until a lot later on in that day. They then decide to go to a park where their camper gets attacked by a bear. Manny fires a flare that the Heffleys had, which leads to them getting kicked out. Things start looking brighter, though, when they head to this campsite called Camper's Eden. Of course, though, there's still a lot of unlucky stuff that happens to the Heffleys here. The most important one to note right now is that they're attacked by teenagers launching watermelons with a large slingshot. Susan then makes Greg hang out with a group of people whose names I could not care enough about to tell you. Two things that are important are that Greg has a nickname in this group, so they don't know his real name, and that the group takes their revenge on the teenagers by soaking them in water and later with ketchup and mustard, which attracts bees. This led to the group, except for Greg and another kid, falling into a trap by the camp's director, and what ends up happening is that they blame the whole incident on Greg while using the fake name Greg gave them. This leads to Greg wanting to lay low so that he doesn't get into trouble, but then one night, a massive storm happens, which causes the bridge to enter and exit the campsite to be destroyed. And just to make matters worse, the Heffleys get attacked by a skunk. The whole place is now in chaos as people start looking anywhere for more supplies, and the Heffleys knew they had to get out there, and Greg has an idea. Part of the water around the area was really shallow, so they would try to drive over it to get out. But as they try this, the car gets caught by the waves, and the camper starts getting filled with water, so everyone climbs up to the top of it. Luckily for them, they see that the seeds are in the water, so they jump down and cling to them. Everyone except for Manny, who somehow is able to turn the camper around so that it lodges in perfectly to the part of the bridge that was destroyed. Manny then sets off the flare again, and everyone at the campsite begins to leave. In the end, the Headleys are the only ones left at the campsite, and in a surprise twist, they end up actually having a really good time for the rest of the trip. And that's the story of The Deep End. Now let me talk about how this is the worst book in the series. Imagine if the ending of Wrecking Ball was an entire book. That is The Deep End. This book dials the insanity of the Wimpy Kid series up to an 11. Nearly every single event that happens in this book is so unnecessarily over the top. And that final scene in the camper is the worst moment in the Diary of Wimpy Kid series. It's not even close. The main cast barely feels like characters anymore. They are less characters and more vessels for us to see the wacky hijinks that occur on their trip. And this is the same way you could describe almost half of the books in these past two eras. Seriously, Jeff Kinney is really running out of ideas if this is the third Heffley's Go on a Trip story we've had, especially since this concept is really just the long haul and getaway mushed together into one story. Also, the group of kids I talked about, it's the same issue I had with the Meltdown. All these characters are introduced and are never going to be mentioned ever again. So it feels like introducing the group of kids that Greg hangs out with is just a massive waste of time. In conclusion, Diary of a Wimpy Kid at this point is a completely different series compared to where it began. It doesn't feel at all like the original two eras in the slightest. It's honestly sad because there's clearly more story potential in these books, but it's just not being accessed. Hopefully things get better, but let's be honest, there's really nowhere else to go but up. And man, with all that talking, I almost completely forgot about the things I noticed segment, so let's just get that done real quick. This one is insanely short. I found barely anything to talk about. The first thing I want to talk about is the fact that the Diary of a Wimpy Kid books now have to take place in current times. Because here's the thing, the original Diary of a Wimpy Kid books had to take place in the late 2000s because of a bunch of different things that are mentioned in it. And you would assume that the way the timeline works is that it would just keep going like regular time, with the books going from the late 2000s to the early 2010s. But this book just completely messes with that by the fact that apparently in Diary of a Wimpy Kid, COVID exists, meaning that this book has to take place in 2019 or 2020. That or somehow the Wimpy Kid timeline got so messed up to the point that COVID existed in 2011. But it really just feels that at this point, there's no caring about the timeline whatsoever. Oh my gosh. I actually had barely anything to talk about. This is the last thing. I just want to talk about how really strange the ending is. And that's the fact that, in the end, it's just a perfectly normal happy ending. Because all the Heffleys are left alone on the resort, and they're just free to do whatever they want there. Which just feels like really weird. To the point that this book doesn't really even feel like a Diary of a Wimpy Kid book. Because with the issues that other books had, there are at least some pieces which still felt like classic Diary of a Wimpy Kid, but there's just absolutely nothing here. That's all for the things I noticed, so let's move on to the next break of this video, where I talk about the Awesome Friendly Kids series. In 2019, Jeff Kinney decided to create the first proper spin-off of the Diary of a Wimpy Kid books. These books would instead follow Rowley through his perspective, thus finally being able to see things without Greg's bias. I'm not going to go into too much detail with each book, as there are 3 of them, so I'll talk about my opinions on them real quick. The Awesome Friendly Kid book is honestly pretty solid. Everyone feels really in character in this book, now that they are in their daily lives and on some absurd adventure. I wish this book told a proper story instead of multiple random stories, but I really still enjoy that this book kind of feels like a return to form character-wise. The second book, Rowley Jefferson's Awesome Friendly Adventure, is completely different, as we follow a fairy tale story written by Rowley. Each chapter ends with Rowley showing Greg what he's done, with Greg adding his own feedback that massively changes his story. While I like the fact that Greg views the story as a way to get famous and causes really big changes to the story to make it more marketable, I feel like this is a really odd direction to take the series, considering how great it was to just see the lives of these characters outside the insane events that previous books had. So this is definitely worse than the previous one. But the worst is easily the final book, Rowley Jefferson's Awesome Friendly Spooky Stories, as it somehow is able to combine the worst aspects of the previous 2 books into one. Firstly, you have the issue of making things into anthologies with no overarching story being told, and second, there's the issue that Greg and Rowley are not the main focus here. In fact, the 2 of them don't even show up until the final story. This is easily the worst as, at this point, it isn't even a Diary of a Wimpy Kid book, or an Awesome Friendly Kid book. This is just something completely different. So when it comes to this series, it starts as a mixed bag, with some potential that continues going down in quality as it kept going. And this also shows kind of the issue with the modern books. The quality of the books faltered because they spent less time focusing on the characters and rather focused on what were the funniest set pieces they could make. And now, for most people, your hopes wouldn't really be high for the rest of the series right now, and that makes sense. But let's see what happens when we go to the next book, Diary of a Wimpy Kid, Big Shot. No recurring characters leave or introduced here, but there is one huge thing that'll be mentioned and talked about in more detail later. This book begins with Greg at field day in his school, where everyone is desperately trying to win so that they can get a free day off from school. One thing that's important to mention is that Greg ends up being traded to another class by his homeroom teacher. In the end, the lunch ladies win, and everyone gets school off, as the school probably realized how big of a mess it would be if the janitors had to make lunch that day. And Greg thinks that having to worry about physical activities is over now, except Susan wants Greg to try out for basketball. Greg goes to tryouts and hopes he doesn't make the cut, and Greg thinks that he didn't make it, but it turns out he did. As one of the best players couldn't make it to tryouts, so his dad created a team for his son, and all of the players who didn't make the cut. And we see that Greg's team stinks. And it gets even worse when their best player, Preet, gets injured during a practice. One thing that we do see is that Greg is surprisingly really good at backward basketball shots. This doesn't help though, as we see later on, Greg's team loses to their rival town 103-2, and in the end, they hadn't won a single game the whole season. And after they play their final game, Greg thinks it's all over, but Susan has other plans. A tournament for kids who didn't win a single game is being held, and Susan takes over as coach, having the whole team enter the tournament. With the tournament, the rules are that whatever team wins gets to go home finally winning a game. This means that Greg's team is now fighting to not be the worst team in the entire state, and we see them lose game after game. Finally, they reach the final game, and out of nowhere, Preet rejoins the team, having left with his dad when Susan became the coach. Susan then subs Greg out and brings in Preet. One kid on the other team gets injured during the game, and it seems like they're going to win by default, but Susan wants to win fair and square, so she makes Greg join the other team, just like how Greg's teacher made Greg join another class during field day at the beginning of the book. The team Greg just joined is 2 points behind, and right at the last few moments, Greg gets the ball and he realizes something. Susan had put Greg on the other team because she knew that Greg stunk at the game. Greg by now didn't care anymore about the game, so he just throws the basketball backward. And everyone watches in pure silence as the ball goes across the entire court and makes it into the basket. Greg's new team has won, and while Susan and the others are clearly upset, Greg doesn't care as, in the end, he was the hero of the story in his eyes. That's it. That's Dive Wimpy Kid. They got it. Let me properly start the review segment before I start talking too much. This book is only pretty good, but it is definitely the greatest step in the right direction that Wimpy Kid could have taken. The main cast feels completely in character again, especially with Greg in one of the best conclusions of the series that really shows who Greg as a person is, with him doing things that benefit himself. While this book does do the thing where Greg is thrown into a situation that's not his fault, it subverts your expectations in a good way by having Greg actually do something instead of being passive like he's been so far in this era. I love the direction this book has taken the series in, and hopefully it keeps it up in the final book. But before we can do that, we need to talk about things I noticed. Firstly, I want to mention the thing I was talking about in the character segment, and that's the fact that they actually bring back a couple of really small characters from across the series in this book. For example, two people that are on the team are Darren and Marcus Woodley, who I mentioned all the way back in The Last Straw. They're the two kids that Frank had to be with on the Boy Scouts trip, with the thing to note being that they always get into fights, which also happens here in this book. And they also bring back Ruby Bird, who is this character introduced in the third wheel, who is very similar to Fregley. And Greg was really worried about being near her because one time she got in trouble for biting their coach. And honestly, it's just so nice seeing Jeff Kinney bringing back old characters because it really makes the world feel more alive. Now, across the series, Greg has actually played quite a few sports, and I just want to spend some time here talking about the different sports Greg has played. We see beginning in Roderick Rules that Greg was on the swim team, so we know that swimming was a sport Greg played. And we also see in The Last Straw that Greg begins playing soccer. Greg is also mentioned in The Last Straw having played baseball before, and from the looks of it, the last sport that Greg has played is in this book, which is basketball. So in total, Greg has played 4 sports. The next thing I want to talk about is the whole thing with Greg being able to do backwards shots really good. Because I actually made a whole video a while back explaining how Greg is actually good at backwards basketball shots. And I'm not going to talk about it in too much detail because you guys can go see the video for that. But it has to actually do with one storyline in Diary of an Awesome Friendly Kid, which explains it. So yeah, once this video is done, if you want an explanation for why Greg is so good at backwards shots, you should go check that out. There's this one storyline I mentioned where Greg's team has to go up against this rival school, and it's the school in the town called Slacksville. And they talk about how Greg's town really hates Slacksview because apparently a really long time ago, their town was supposed to have a jewelry factory, but then people from Slacksville bought the factory and took it from them. And the way that, and you know what? To make it easier to mention it, I'm just gonna go by the name of the movies, and Plainview got their revenge a year earlier by changing their zoning laws so that a dump would be put in Slacksville. And then it seemed like maybe they wanted to do a peace offering, so Slacksville decided to donate a bunch of wood that Plainview uses for a bonfire in the summer. But it turns out that if they burn the wood, it will release dangerous chemicals, and Slacksville knew this. So now they just had this giant pile of wood in the middle of the park that they couldn't move. And that shows why Plainview hates Slacksville so much, because Slacksville has always just been known as being better than them. And so we see their game, and obviously Greg's team just does awful, and the only time they score a point is when one of Greg's teammates throws the ball, it bounces off of someone's head, and goes into the basket, which made the people of Slacksville really upset because they thought they were going to win with the other team getting 0 points. And one thing that ends up happening that's kind of funny is the fact that eventually they get to 101 points, and that makes the scoreboard look like it's 2-1. But they can't even get that small victory because Slacksville got another 2 points, leading the game to be 103-2. I also want to talk about this related to Susan because she's a pretty important character in this book, and that's the fact that she isn't really doing any of this for Greg. She's doing it entirely for herself because Susan used to be on a basketball team, and at the very last game, she ended up missing the final shot, which would have led to them winning. So in reality, she's only using Greg to relive her old basketball experiences, which, to be honest, makes you feel not that bad for her when Greg ends up winning for the other team, because she didn't care if the team won. She only wanted to feel that she won. And that's going to be all the things I noticed in Big Shot. So now, let's move on to the final intermission, where we'll be talking about the animated Diary of a Wimpy Kid films. In 2012, the Diary of a Wimpy Kid Dog Days movie was released, being the end of the live-action film trilogy, but JF Kinney already had plans in mind for a future special. This would have been an animated special based on Cabin Fever and would have released in 2014. This never happened, but years later, the special would transform into what we know now as the 2021 animated Diary of a Wimpy Kid film. And the next year, a sequel, Roderick Rules, was also created, and more sequels are being planned to be released in future years. I don't really have the time to go into extreme detail on the stories, especially since they are pretty similar to the stories of the books, although they do have a couple of drastic differences. I want to talk mainly about my opinions on these films. These are the worst Diary of Wimpy Kid movies, because not only are they not really great Wimpy Kid movies, these movies are so short, they barely even count as movies. It feels like too many things happen way too fast due to the short runtime, and I feel like when it comes to characters, it's a really mixed bag. Sometimes characters will be super faithful to themselves to the books, even adding some small details to make them better. Other times, it feels like they are not at all in character. The biggest example is Greg and Rowley in the first movie. They do everything in their power to make you feel bad for Greg. Everything bad that happens either wasn't Greg's fault or was an accident. Meanwhile, Riley here is just a flat out bad person. In the first movie, Riley steals Zooey Mama, which never happened in any other Wimpy Kid related thing, and that makes Greg feel like he's in the right, which he isn't supposed to be. I will say that I like some parts of how Greg acts in the second movie. I find it weird how much he wants to hang out with Roderick, but when Greg uses the pictures of the party to his advantage, that feels like something that's completely in character for Greg. I also like the parallel they made between Greg, Roderick, Manny, and Frank's brothers. Hopefully, in an adaptation of The Last Straw, that could be explored more. Another big issue I have is the animation. If you look at the teaser shown in 2020 and compare it to the movie, you can clearly see that the movie looks cheaper and less expressive. I would not be surprised if there are budget cuts. But I feel that the main issue is the way the shots are positioned. The movie could have possibly gone away with the animation it had if it had camera angles similar to the Peanuts movie in the teaser, or at least if it had more dynamic shots than what we got. Now, I've had good and bad to say, so you're probably wondering why I said these two were worse in the long haul. It's because there at least feel like there was a genuine attempt to make a good movie with the long haul, even if it failed. These movies feel kind of soulless, as if they were only made because they knew the Wimpy Kid brand would sell. But at least in Roderick Rules, there are a couple scenes where it feels like they tried, so hopefully in the future, these movies become more feature length so you can actually get the time to properly invest people into these versions of the cast. I've been going on for a bit now, so let's move on to the final book as of now in the Diary of a Wimpy Kid franchise. Diary of a Wimpy Kid, Diaper, Overload. Technically, this is the final appearance of every Diary of a Wimpy Kid character, but obviously naming them would be dumb because a lot of these recurring characters are going to be appearing in the next book, so let's head on to the story. This book follows Greg having quite an interesting revelation, and that's that being famous might not be as great as he thinks, because famous people always have their private information revealed. So Greg starts thinking that it would be better to know personally someone who is famous. This leads into the main story where Roger decides that he and his band, Loaded Diaper, are going to a music competition known as the Battle of the Bands to win. Throughout a solid chunk of the book, we see Loaded Diaper trying various methods to get their name out to people. They go to the mall to get photos, except they didn't know it was for baby photos, so that meant those were worthless. Loaded Diaper hasn't been able to do any gigs as the band's doors were broken. The band ends up in a competition where if you have your hand on a van for the longest, you got to keep it. And after a very long time, Bill and Roderick argue about who should win it. They decide on a deal and put their hands off, thinking that they were the last people. But that turns out to not be the case. Roderick tries to create a social media account for their music, but some outtakes become really popular instead, and they continue to do bloopers until it goes too far and they head back to music, which isn't nearly as popular, so they discontinue the idea. Deciding properly recording a song is the best way to get the word of Loaded Diaper out, the band decides to rent a studio for a song. A bunch of incidents happen though, so they are only able to get one good take of one song. Loaded Diaper gets a lucky break as they are able to get a gig at a club, but Roderick forgot his drumsticks at home. So the only thing they can do is break into a nearby restaurant and steal the animatronic drummer's drumsticks. This is a horrid idea as not only does a security guard begin chasing them, but when they get away, they are able to get the drumsticks with the animatronic's hands still attached to them. And they open the hands and accidentally close them, with the hand clamping on to one of the band members' legs. Even after all that, the band ends up playing terribly and they didn't even get paid anything. The band then decides that what they need to do is find and talk to the band members Metallic Chihuahua, Roderick's favorite band that became huge after winning the competition. They find the bassist, but the only thing they really learn is why the band broke up. Loaded Diaper gets a chance to perform again at a festival, but they got put into a side stage where there were barely any people. Then they decide to find the drummer, who tells them that becoming a popular band was hopeless and that they should quit while they're ahead. They continue going, but things get worse as there's another band called Stank, which is in a similar style to Loaded Diaper but is way more popular. Bill falls in love with a girl, bringing her to the recordings, and that makes it a lot harder for them to play any music. And to just make things worse, Loaded Diaper is now being threatened with legal action because the band name is similar to the name of a trading card from a long time ago. So the rest of the band decides to ditch Roderick, viewing it as not worth being sued. Roderick decides to get some other people, including Greg, to join Loaded Diaper for the competition. Before they play, they find out Bill has joined Stank and made it practically entirely about him. When they perform, the rest of the band is ready to fail. But it turns out Roderick had the audio of the one good song they played at the studio going, so everyone was fake playing. Everything was going great until they realized something. The audio Roderick had wasn't at the good recording, so people immediately realize that they're faking it and they start getting really mad. As if things can get worse, the lawyer who threatened them as well as the security guard who chased them go on stage. But when Metallic Chihuahua's drummer and bassist on Paris stage, they realize something. This is all four members of the band. And after the four of them are all done arguing, they realize that people are cheering for the four of them. So they begin playing, and it turns out they win the Battle of the Bands for the second time, which is the first time in history it has happened. In the end, Bill is fired from Stank and rejoins Loaded Diaper, and Greg is just glad that he's done dealing with the rock and roll lifestyle. This is the main plot of Diaper Overload, so time for my opinions. This book I'd say is around the same level as Big Shot. It's nice seeing Roderick being the main focus here, as he wasn't really that big in the previous book. Also, it does feel like a perfectly natural progression of Greg's character for him to realize that he doesn't want to be famous because of the effort you need to put in with people invading your privacy. That makes sense because the one thing Greg is more of than egotistical is lazy. I find the story here really fun. It's nice that we get to see a little bit more details on characters that we've known existed for a long time, but didn't really know anything about. And this book is great as it shows that Big Shot was the fluke. Diary of a Wimpy Kid is back. Now, one last time, the things I noticed. One thing that we actually learn is a little bit of Loaded Diaper's discography. We find out that Loaded Diaper has something over 50 songs, and we actually see a small list of the songs they have. And one thing that's really neat is that they actually reference a couple of other Diary of a Wimpy Kid things here. For example, Can You Smell Us Now is a song that's played in the animated Roderick Rules movie. And also, they show Exploded Diaper, which was the song that Roderick played in Roderick Rules. And the other songs listed, because they don't show all of them, they only show a few, are One Wiper, Diaper Overload, which is the main one used in this book, Diaper Igniter, Potty Mouth, Leaky Commode, Down the Drain, Monkey House, The Runs, Raise a Stink, Small Test, Stink It Up, Toilet Lips, and Bloated Diaper. One thing that I find really neat is the fact that Exploded Diaper is X'd out, which makes complete sense as most likely Roderick doesn't want to play that song since it could bring back up the dancing mom incident from the second book. And I just find that a really neat detail. I also want to do another similar thing like I did in Big Shot, where I talked about multiple things from across the series. And in this case, instead of sports Greg has played, I want to talk about some of the crimes Greg has committed, because there are quite a few across the series. The first thing I immediately thought of was in Roderick Rules when Greg accidentally entered the woman's bathroom, but apparently I've looked up stuff online and that's not illegal. Greg would probably get in trouble, but it wouldn't be considered a crime. But the next thing that you can think of that would definitely be a crime is in Cabin Fever when Greg and Rowley accidentally vandalize the school. But I'm guessing since Greg and Rowley are kids, and since this is their first time they've committed a proper crime, they probably wouldn't have super severe charges. And even then, we later find out in the book that Greg wasn't even going to be arrested. So most likely the only thing that happened was that Greg got in trouble at school. Next up, the next crime would be in the long hall where the Heffleys break into the Beardos hotel room. Now this would either count as criminal trespassing or burglary, and it's kind of hard to tell which one it would be in this case because Frank steals the Beardos car keys, and I don't know how that would affect the crime they committed. But anyway, at the absolute minimum, it was trespassing. At the maximum, burglary. The next crime would be the ending of the getaway, where the Heffleys commit trespassing again. And I'm going to be honest, I don't even know what kind of crime would be committed by what they did in the resort when they broke back in. But yeah, they did trespassing again, and probably a lot of other things considering everything they did at the resort. I'm pretty sure the next crime would be in the deep end, but I don't think it'll be anything serious. It's that it's illegal to use a flare gun irresponsibly, which we see this happens earlier on in the book when Manny uses a flare gun at the park. But I feel like this could be really easily defended if the Heffleys just explained that they were attacked by a bear. But yeah, since they didn't explain it, the next crime would be using a flare irresponsibly. And the last case I want to mention, and it's the main reason I want to talk about it here, is because there are quite a few crimes committed across diaper overload, which technically I don't really have to talk about because they're committed by Loaded Diaper and not Greg, but I still feel like I want to mention them here. The first crime they would have would be trespassing. This would be when Loaded Diaper goes to the building that Metallic Chihuahua played in, because they wanted to play on the rooftop just like Metallic Chihuahua did. And the thing is, after that concert, you weren't allowed to go to the roof, but Loaded Diaper still tried to do it anyway. And there's one moment where Roderick tries to connect their equipment and accidentally goes into the window of someone using the bathroom. So yeah, if you're wondering if the first part was trespassing because this was a public building, then that part is definitely trespassing. And also, while they're there, they accidentally block a loading zone, but that ends up being waived. And also, the band commits another case of vandalism by taping a bunch of diapers around the park, and later doing a similar thing again, but instead with a Loaded Diaper logo. And this would also count as damaging property, as they put a bunch of Loaded Diaper logos across somebody's car. They also commit theft when they steal the drumsticks from that restaurant. And now that I'm thinking about it, I'm actually remembering another crime from a previous book, Old School, because technically in that book, Greg does harbor a fugitive when Greg, Fruit, and Billy run away from the park. And okay, back to diaper overload. And the very last crime committed, I'm guessing, would be copyright infringement, since Loaded Diaper had a similar name to a trading card. And they're threatened with legal action, and while the others just ditch Roderick, Roderick doesn't change the name. So they still could easily be sued for still having the name Loaded Diaper. And that's all the most notable crimes that are committed across the books. There are probably a couple I missed, but those are the main ones I remember. I want to talk about the whole thing with the Bill romance subplot. What happens is that Bill goes to this donut shop and he meets a girl there where they fall in love. And she starts going to all their band practices, and we see how that really affects things. And eventually, what happens is that Roderick forces him to break up with her, which they end up making Greg have to do. And now we see that Bill's an absolute mess due to them breaking up. But we do see that when Bill joins Stank that they're back together. And the last thing I want to talk about is going into more detail about the lip syncing incident. And that's that when they went to the studio, they had two different recordings of the same song. One that worked out, and one where Bill started coughing a lot because earlier on he accidentally swallowed a guitar pick. So there are two different recordings of that song, and Roderick accidentally picked the one where Bill started coughing a lot. And that's what made people immediately realize that they weren't actually playing anything. That's all for Diaper Overload, and I want to do something before we properly close the series. I want to do a mini intermission where I talk about things across the franchise I missed. This will be very loosely structured, so be prepared for that. Let's begin. First, I want to talk about the theme songs in the movies and plays. I'll talk about which are the best ones and which are the worst. The original trilogy theme is easily the best. It's super catchy and memorable. It just fits perfectly with the tone of the films. I love also how across the three films, there are so many different variations of the theme that all work in their own ways. Next is the long haul movie theme, which is easily the worst. it is super unmemorable, and it's really hard to remember parts of the song compared to every other Wimpy Kid theme, which is easy to remember. Next up, I want to talk about the music in the Wimpy Kid play in general. All the songs in there are great, especially the main theme stuck in the middle. Like the first theme, it's super catchy. And lastly, I want to talk about the animated movie theme. It's one of the few things I really liked about the animated films. It really gives a similar feeling to what the original theme did, by being really upbeat and being used in different ways across the films. To be honest, besides the Long Haul theme, none of these are really bad, but I have no clue what happened with the long haul, especially since they got the guy who made the music in the second and third movies back for it. Not only that, but in the intro for the long haul, you can hear the classic Wimpy Kid theme. It practically seems that whatever touched the long haul movie became automatically worse. And on the topic of music, there are actually three loaded diaper songs they can actually listen to. Firstly are two songs from the live action movies, which unfortunately you can only hear a part of. These are Exploded Diaper from the second movie and the cover of Baby in the third. The third song is from the animated Roger Cruise movie, which you can actually listen to in its entirety, called Can You Smell Us Now? If you look them up on YouTube, you'll be able to find them easily. I want to talk about a deal that was had between Diary of a Wimpy Kid and McDonald's. In 2016 and 2019, in some areas, you could have gotten miniature Diary of a Wimpy Kid books with your Happy Meal. These would contain stories that mirrored events from the actual books. A few of these were released, but not many people know. They were apparently only released in the UK for 1 year and in Australia for another. There is another toy-related thing I want to talk about, and that's the Diary of Wimpy Kid games. Now, these aren't video games. The only video games made for Diary of Wimpy Kid were online Flash games, so sadly, there's no big budget console Wimpy Kid games to talk about. But there were a couple of board games and a word game. The word game is called Mad Libs, which is based on a moment from the books. In the game, you would read the stories in the game while filling in the blanks with any adjectives you wanted. The first board game is called the Cheese Touch board game. It's basically a normal board game, except that if you get a question wrong, you would get the Cheese Touch. The last game is known as a 10-second challenge. Here you're tasked to do a certain thing in 10 seconds, and whoever is able to complete everything in the time frame is the winner. These seem like they would be really fun, though I've never played any of them, so if you ever see any of these games out in the wild, I recommend you check them out. And while I said there weren't any proper Big Wimpy Kid games, there is one small game. It's just called The Meltdown, and it's a game where you play as Greg fighting other kids during a snowball fight. You have to hit as many kids as you can with snowballs while not getting hit yourself. If you want to waste a little bit of time, check it out, but there's honestly barely any replay value in it. Across the franchise, there have been quite a few people who've played Greg. We've had Zachary Gordon in the live action trilogy, Jason Drucker from the Long Haul film, Brady Noon, who voiced Greg in the animated movies. In the plays, Greg was originally played by Ricky Falbo. Most recently, he was played by Huxley Weistemeyer. There are possibly others who played him in the play, but I'm honestly not really sure as there isn't a concrete list. But there is one more place where Greg gained a new actor, and that's in the commercial for the Deep End, where multiple characters in the Wimpy Kid series got voice actors who appeared only there. In this case, Greg is played by Anton Griffin. Also, the wiki mentions another actor named Brendan Thomas, but I'm not really sure where he plays Greg, as on the wiki, it shows absolutely no information besides his name. There's no link to whatever he played Greg in. Who knows? Maybe he also played him in the play. I'm not sure. I also want to talk about figures made by Funko for Diary of Wimpy Kid. They aren't Funko Pops. They are figures made by Funko. Three were made of Greg, Rowley, and Fregley. These are insanely cursed. We've seen multiple times that Wimpy Kid looks kind of weird in 3D, as shown by the movies. If I owned one of these, I'd sleep with one eye open every night. Starting in 2010, Diary of Wimpy Kid became part of the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade. Over the years, there have been three versions of the balloon. The first in 2010 shows Greg holding his diary looking worried. The second in 2016 shows Greg in winter attire, falling while holding his diary. And the newest one in 2022 shows Greg looking more like the movie version, holding his diary right as he's about to touch cheese. One thing that I really liked about the first few parades is how they played the classic Wimpy Kid theme when the balloon appeared. Sadly, the first balloon was apparently destroyed according to Jeff Kinney. This is really rare when it comes to the parade apparently, but it is kind of neat that he says that he has a certificate that has a piece of the balloon attached to it. One last thing to talk about is something that you can check out now that the series is ending if you want more Diary of a Wimpy Kid content. First of all, I recommend you look at the series by yourself, as my videos aren't substitutes for the books or the movies. I definitely recommend you view those on your own time if you haven't. But the last thing I want to talk about is none other than r/loaded diaper. This is the largest subreddit dedicated to Wimpy Kid. It's great if you want to talk to other Wimpy Kid fans, but the biggest thing there is LLBs. LLBs, or look-like books, are Diary of a Wimpy Kid books made by fans. They're basically fan fiction, except they're actually made in the style of a proper Wimpy Kid book. There are tons of these on r/loaded diaper, and a lot of them are really funny because, unlike the mainline books, there's no canon to follow, so people just go completely nuts when writing these. And I definitely recommend reading some of them if you want to have a fun time. The amount of them on there is so large that you could probably spend weeks reading through them. So if you got through the series and feel like you need more of a Wimpy Kid fix, definitely check it out. That's it for this final intermission, so let's talk about this era of the series first. This era kind of felt just the same as the end of the previous one, right until Big Shot. It felt like the series took a complete 180 and decided to go back to what made Wimpy Kid special. Honestly, with how great of a step these last two books were, you'd almost forget how bad the rest of the era was at this point. While I don't think Diary of a Wimpy Kid is back to the point it was in its golden era, I think that if it keeps going like this, by focusing on characters instead of what wacky events they go through, then things will be fine. And that seems like it might be the case considering what things we've been told about the next Wimpy Kid book, Diary of a Wimpy Kid, no brainer. So the series really is looking up. Now I just want to talk right now about the entire Diary of a Wimpy Kid franchise in general, and what to me makes it so special. Diary of a Wimpy Kid, when it came out, was like no other children's book series before it. Almost every children's book followed characters who were either morally good or at least characters who in the end will learn their lesson and change for the better. But Diary of a Wimpy Kid is completely different. Greg Heffley is a character who is lazy, selfish, and manipulative. In any other book, Greg would learn his lesson and become a better person by the end. But Greg ignores the lesson completely and doesn't change at all by the time of the next book. And that, in my opinion, shows what makes Diary of a Wimpy Kid so special. The world is a place that just kind of stinks. Greg is a bad person in a bad world. Things don't magically change by the end. Jeff Kinney wrote possibly the most realistic world in any children's book series. People in real life don't just change overnight. It's a gradual shift. And since Greg is never aging, we never see said gradual shift. That's intriguing because it kind of changes the core of the Wimpy Kid series. It turns from the sort of black comedy into a tragedy. One of the major points in Diary of a Wimpy Kid is growing up, but Greg never is going to be able to grow up. He's always stuck in the place he is right now. We see time and time again that Greg is actually capable of caring and that he can do things that aren't for himself. Greg doesn't grow up in the books because he doesn't want to. He doesn't grow up because he physically isn't able to. Diary of a Wimpy Kid is really sad when you look at it through that lens. I honestly wish there was an attempt to make Greg grow up because while they are way more hidden compared to other children's books, there is a lesson to learn in Diary of a Wimpy Kid. The first thing is that to grow up, you need to start fixing issues with their character so that you'll live a better and happier life as you grow up. And there's the second part. It's that change will happen no matter how hard you fight it. Time will pass and you'll have to accept that. But since you know this, you also need to cherish the time that you have. Because if you don't, then you'll grow up and you won't have any of those memories to reminisce on. And Diary of a Wimpy Kid would have been able to fully explore this opportunity if they just let Greg grow up. But sadly, we're still stuck in middle school. The thing is, though, even if we don't see Greg properly growing up, those points still stand. We see these messages interwoven across the entire series. Diary of a Wimpy Kid, despite not showing the destination, shows the journey of Greg becoming a better person. And sometimes the journey is better than the destination. We will know that as the journey of Greg Heffley is still going, but so far, while there have been ups and downs, this has been an incredible ride. You might have been wondering why I decided to do this series. Is it because you're so insanely bored? Is it because Wimpy Kid videos do really well? The truth is, there are two reasons. The first one's not really that important. I've been a fan of the Wimpy Kid books since second grade. I've watched tons of videos talking about the franchise, but I've never seen one that goes into as much detail as this one has, except for maybe an iceberg video or something. The second reason is that just last month, I graduated middle school. Greg Heffley went from this kid that I found cool and funny as a small kid to a kid that I really related to as we were the same age, and by now, I'm older than Greg. I'm past the point of life Greg is in. And I just felt like this series deserved one last beautiful send-off before I moved on in life. That doesn't mean I'm going to quit making Wimpy Kid videos. Those are really fun to make, and I'm still going to continue enjoying this series until the day the series is over, or until I'm over. Now, those points I made earlier are really going to start applying to me. And I just want to say them again because it feels really important that you all hear these messages, as everyone needs to hear these. Diary of a Wimpy Kid is a series about growing up. It talks about the topic of growing up in two ways. First, it's how necessary it is for people to clean up their act and learn to be less selfish as they begin growing up. Because as you enter the real world, growing up mentally is the most important thing you could ever do. And second, it's how we need to face a really harsh truth. We're only going to be alive for so long. Time will pass, and things that we viewed as essential parts of our life will disappear. Having to face change can be absolutely terrifying, but you can't stop things from changing. So enjoy the things you have right now, as soon they'll be gone, and be prepared to face anything that comes your way. Because as long as you're ready for any changes in your life, everything will be alright in the end. That's going to be it for this series. I hope you all enjoyed it and that you really take this message to heart. Go spend time enjoying the things you have in your life, and I'll see you in the next video, stream, short, post, or wherever else I'm at in the next one. And remember, this is a journal, not a diary.